Hello, everybody, and we are back for the second of three lectures in total about the human history of Antarctica. And this particular lecture, Lecture 14, is not cleanly divided into two halves. The material in both halves focuses on the heroic age of Antarctic exploration and the events leading up to it, as well as the exploration in its immediate aftermath. And many of the most famous Antarctic figures are from this era, like Shackleton, Amundsen, and Scott. A total of 17 expeditions took place during this period, which is defined more than anything by the actual focus on polar exploration and research, as well as the large number of expeditions launched within a pretty short window of time and the hardships and resilience experienced during these voyages. We'll start this lecture by exploring some factors that led to Antarctic exploration to speed up, and then we'll delve into some specifics of a number of the heroic age expeditions. I don't cover every single one in detail, but I do at least once allude to all 17 of the expeditions that are usually considered to be the heroic age expeditions, and I spend a longer amount of time on some of the more famous and fascinating stories. And the lecture ends with most of Antarctica having been explored, if not really set up for long-term human habitation just yet. The permanent scientific bases that now dot Antarctica are a pretty recent feature. So I wanted to mention that there are still a couple of presentations happening this week for those of you looking to attend seminars for extra credit. And I also wanted to remind you all of some of the upcoming assignments. Lecture quiz 2 will occur next week, and there will be a review session for lecture quiz number 2 on Monday, May 17th during office hours. And make sure to do lab 6 before Friday night. And I also encourage you to get a head start on reading assignment number 2, which should take an hour or two at most. And there is one more UC Santa Cruz seminar happening this week, as well as a department colloquium. The department colloquium is happening on Thursday, May 13th at 2 p.m. And the the UC Santa Cruz seminar is happening on Friday, May 14th at 12 p.m. And for either of those, you can write a greater than 400 words response in which you address what you learned, what possible connections there were with class. It's quite open-ended, and you can just send that to me via email. And that gives you 3 points that can be added to your midterm exam, or if that takes you to a perfect score on the midterm, any leftover points can go to other assignments. And the Zoom links and the full descriptions for each of these two events are in the May 10th update under the instructor announcements on Gaucho Space. I also wanted to mention something really exciting that's happened with one of our alumna. Dr. Dawn Wright has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and she is an alumna of UCSB Earth Science. She did a project based on GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems, and involves using a combination of geography and geology to obtain a better understanding of landforms. She studied the East Pacific Rise, which is a mid-ocean ridge, just like the ones around Antarctica or in the mid-Atlantic, but this time it's one that's in the Eastern Pacific, off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. And she became the first Black woman to dive onto the ocean floor in Alvin, which is a submersible, or a specially designed submarine that can go deep into the ocean. So being elected to the National Academy of Sciences is a big deal for a scientist or a geologist, and so we're very honored to have her as an alumna of UCSB. Now, turning to this lecture's material, here's a bit of an overview as to how things are going to go. This lecture covers a much more concentrated window of time than does Lecture 13, and only about 23 years overall are covered here, compared to several centuries for Lecture 13. And this is because Antarctic exploration speeds up quite a bit in the late 19th century, and a large number of expeditions to the continent occurred during a pretty concentrated window of time. This period of time from 1897 to 1922 is known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. And these expeditions were motivated much more explicitly by an interest in mapmaking, scientific findings, and in some cases, adventure and glory than many of those we learned about previously, which were much more focused on the economic factors. And that's one reason it's often referred to as the heroic age. With the boldness and the ambition of some of the explorers' plans, like the race to the South Pole, the hardships that they faced, and the stories of survival and resilience that came out of some of these trips being some other factors. Of course, political and imperialistic reasons never completely disappeared. All of the expeditions, um, all of the expeditions by were funded by the governments of countries that would be considered to be imperial powers. And one aspect of the exploration was that potentially these countries would have a greater opportunity to control parts of Antarctica down the line. And we'll later talk about how the Antarctic Treaty was partially enacted so that countries couldn't officially claim Antarctica. And this lecture sees the first people to land in Antarctica and then increasingly ambitious goals: overwintering, then reaching the South Pole, then attempting to cross the entire continent. And by the end of the heroic age, Antarctica had gone from being a continent that humans had never set foot on to one that humans had explored greatly, if not to the extent that it was safe or even possible for permanent settlements like the modern day bases to be established. By the way, this is one of the few cats to have traveled to Antarctica. He was brought on board Shackleton's second expedition, which was his most famous expedition. Um, and he was brought on board by Master Shipwright Harry, or Chippy McNash. The man in this picture is not Chippy McNash, it is Paris Blackborough, who was another crew member. This was a male cat, apparently, but he was often referred to as Mrs. Chippy as a joke because he apparently followed Mr. Chippy around like an obedient wife was supposed to in Victorian times, and the name stuck even after they realized he was a male cat. Unfortunately, Mrs. Chippy did not survive the trip. When Shackleton's crew were trapped in the ice, he ordered that the cat and some of the sled dogs be shot because he didn't believe they could feed them anymore. Apparently, Mr. Chippy never forgave Shackleton for this, and I find this to be a little bit of just a sad touch to that story because all the people made it, but this man's beloved kitty didn't make it. Anyhow, so why did Antarctic exploration speed up? The interesting thing is that the California Gold Rush had a lot to do with it, or at least had a lot to do with the setting the stage for the heroic age. And in 1849, when gold was first discovered in California, Americans began flocking to settle there, and many people immigrated to work in the mines or to build other infrastructure. And some of those people came overland, like the people living in the US already, or straight across the Pacific Ocean in the case of Chinese and other East Asian immigrants. But a lot of people came by boat, both from the east coast of the United States as well as Europe. The Panama Canal had not yet been built, and the Northwest Passage had never really been found, and so the Straits of Magellan remained the safest way to pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific. There was already a sizable population living in the Falkland Islands and on whaling and sealing stations in the subantarctic islands. The Falklands increasingly became important as a ship repair and resupply point, and some of the whaling and sealing settlements began to serve the purpose of being ship repair stations as well. And with more people passing through the straits, including many wealthy and influential people who were on their way to San Francisco, interest in Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, Cape Horn, and what might exist south of Cape Horn began to spread. There were simply more people in the Southern Ocean present. Now, remember that the James Clark Ross expedition, which was the last expedition we talked about during Lecture 13, that ended in 1842, just a bit before the gold rush. There were very few visits to Antarctica in the meantime, but as more people spent time near or in the Southern Ocean, and as governments began to take more notice, that began to change. And an important step occurred in the 1890s when Henrik Bull, who was a Norwegian, and he was in fact searching for a new species of whale that is now known as the southern right whale, he made a voyage south into the Ross Sea, which had not been visited almost 50 years before. The Ross Sea had not had any human visitors since James Clark Ross had gone half a century before. So there was a long gap between the end of the last lecture and the start of this lecture. And Mr. Bull landed on the Possession Islands, which are right off the coast of the mainland in the Ross Sea, and he is thus often considered to be the first person to have definitively set foot in Antarctica. Of course, some accounts indicate that whalers might have done so in the peninsula a bit earlier, But Bull was the first person that we know of for sure. He also documented lichens, and he became the first person to document Antarctica's very scant terrestrial ecology. But the lichens were the first life found in Antarctica. And so the heroic age begins a fair bit after the gold rush, and a fair bit after the James Clark Ross expedition. So again, it's a pretty concentrated period of time, 1897 to 1922. And the first of the various heroic age expeditions is considered to be the Belgian expedition, which we'll talk about next. And the age is considered to have ended after Sir Ernest Shackleton's third and final expedition, by which point a lot more of the Antarctic continent was known to humanity, and the world had entered the tense period between the two world wars. The expeditions of the heroic age were much more distinctly scientific and fact-finding based in nature. The British interest in Antarctica was somewhat renewed by a speech given to the Royal Geographic Society of London by John Murray, in which he urged the importance of not leaving any area of the Earth unexplored. The term heroic age was bestowed later in reference to the increased focus on exploration for its own sake, the ambition of many of the expedition leaders, the hardships they and their men encountered, and the accounts of sacrifice, danger, and bravery that would later become as much popular adventure stories as they are actual historical accounts. And Antarctic research would somewhat once again fall on the back burner during the period leading into the Second World War. But in the aftermath of World War II, many of the maps and discoveries from the heroic age, which of course left many open questions, those served as the starting point for some of the scientific projects related to glaciers, climate, and geology that were initiated during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958, which was in a period of intense research and base building that we'll talk about during the third and final lecture on the human history of Antarctica a bit later, near the very end of the course. So the first expedition that is considered to be part of the heroic age was the Belgian Antarctic expedition, which was fronted by Adrien Vijay de Gerlache. And Belgium was indeed a colonial empire in the 19th century, if you're familiar with that already from a European or African history course. And the Belgium had the resources from its occupation of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo to fund large-scale scientific expeditions. And Gerlache actually went with Roald Amundsen, who would later become the first person to reach the South Pole, as his first mate. They headed to the peninsula and undertook the first sledge journey over the course of a week on Brabant Island, which is an island near the peninsula that's marked in red on the map up here. And his crew became the first to overwinter south of the Antarctic Circle. And remember that when Captain Cook went to Antarctica, or tried to approach Antarctica, he did go south of the Antarctic Circle, but he didn't spend winter south there. He spent winter in New Zealand or Australia. And Gerlache and his crew, in being the first to spend time south of the Antarctic Circle, became the first people to experience the midnight sun. Remember that the circle is defined as the latitude below which land will experience at least one 24-hour period of continuous daylight, as well as one 24-hour period of continuous darkness every year. They ran low on food and had to eat penguins. They had not taken enough food for the winter. And I get a strange kick out of Mr. Gerlache's description of the penguins. It just strangely sounds like a creative outlet, like he just thought of whatever creative way to describe how awful the penguin meat was that he could. If it's possible to imagine a piece of beef, odoriferous codfish, and a canvas-backed duck roasted together in a pot with blood and cod liver oil for sauce, the illustration would be complete. Penguins apparently are not very tasty, at least according to him. The crew eventually had to cut their ship out by hand from the ice to escape. That took them about a month, and it occurred as they were desperately trying to avoid having to spend a second winter trapped in the ice. Happily, only one person died, and they spent a lot of time taking weather observations that would later improve understanding of Antarctic climate. They also took some lichen samples that would provide useful data for mycologists, or people who study mushrooms and other fungi. Now, one of the relatively few expeditions to be privately funded was one that is known as either the Borshkovic Expedition, after the group's Norwegian-born Australian captain, or the Southern Cross Expedition, after the ship they sailed on, which is something you see fairly commonly with these expeditions. A lot of them are named after the ships that were used for the expeditions. And Borshkovic, who was an experienced explorer, was largely the brains of this operation. This crew became the first to overwinter on the Antarctic mainland at Cape Adare, which is located south of New Zealand in northern Victoria Land, and that is north of the Ross Sea and the Dry Valleys. I was in southern Victoria Land when I was collecting my samples. These folks were in northern Victoria Land. And they discovered that Antarctica had insects. They became the first people to document animals on the Antarctic mainland, and perhaps even more excitingly, they recorded observations of Adelie penguins while they were visiting the Ross Ice Shelf. And they discovered that the Ross Ice Shelf had actually retreated a fair bit since James Clark Ross had visited the Ross Sea 50 years before. That might actually have something to do with warming from the advent of the industrial age. But anyhow, it was interesting for them to observe that the ice shelves had changed shape and that the ice shelves were dynamic moving features. And an unfortunate incident almost brought this entire episode to a disastrous end. They almost had their huts burnt down by a fire caused by candles. So fires in Antarctica can really blow out of control. The winds are strong, and that can whip up a fire within minutes. And to this day, that is why the McMurdo base crew has a fire department on hand, because if a fire does get out of control in Antarctica, it can be really, really bad. They actually had a really big fire in 1978 at McMurdo in which the chapel was destroyed and a bunch of other large buildings were destroyed. So the fire department in Antarctica is quite important, and Mr. Borshkovic and his folks were the first people to realize that, probably. Now, one figure that will come across a fair bit again is Robert Falcon Scott, and he will be one of the men involved in the legendary race to the South Pole that we'll talk about later, and he may be one of the figures that you've heard of before you took this class. You might also have seen the name Scott if you've looked in detail at a map of Antarctica, because a number of features in the Ross Sea and near McMurdo Base are named after him. Scott he went to Antarctica several times, and before the race to the South Pole, he first visited Antarctica as part of the first British government-funded expedition since the James Clark Ross Expedition of 1849. So the UK government had not sent anybody to Antarctica for about 60 years by the time that Scott landed. Sir Robert Falcon Scott landed near the present location of McMurdo Base on Ross Island, and the hut from his stay is still visible, and I was able to walk past it. You can't go in, but you can look in the window and see just how well it and the stuff inside has been preserved by the coldness and the dryness. The coldness and the dryness really inhibit microbiotic activity and mean that things in Antarctica just don't decay in the same way they do elsewhere in the world. He attempted a trip to the South Pole before he would actually make it there several years later. He tried to use sledges pulled by dogs, and his crew beat Mr. Borshkovic's previous farthest south record, but he soon realized that he had made mistakes when he was planning the dogs' food, and he had to kill some of the weaker dogs, and a number of his men started to suffer from snow blindness, which is when your eyes start to get overwhelmed by the ultraviolet light reflected back into your eyes from the snow. Many of the Inuit people have special goggles made of bone that are little slits that help you avoid having the sun reflected into your eyes from below. They didn't have these goggles, and so snow blindness caused problems. They also had problems with scurvy, which is a disease you get when you don't get enough vitamin C. So Mr. Scott had to go back because his men just were not doing well. He was quite disappointed, and he would, of course, begin planning another expedition that was solely designed to reach the pole. Shackleton, who we'll talk about separately later, actually came to Antarctica during this expedition. He was Mr. Scott's third officer, and he was one of the people who attempted to reach the South Pole during this visit, but he got scurvy. He became so weak from scurvy that he had to be carried back on a sledge and had to be sent home early. And some accounts indicate that this was the source of a rift between Mr. Scott and Mr. Shackleton. But that's been part of the mythos of the Antarctic explorers. It's not clear how angry Shackleton actually was, but it's kind of part of the myth that Shackleton and Scott didn't like each other for this reason. In spite of the fact that he didn't reach the South Pole, they did come across some important findings. The geologist on board was Mr. Farrar, and he is in fact whom the Farrar basalts that are the result of rifting during the Jurassic period, which we learned about earlier. Well, those were named after him. And those basalts are exposed in the dry valleys, and Scott actually discovered the dry valleys in the second year of this first expedition. While attempting to reach the interior, he explored and mapped the dry valleys a fair bit. And even though he was forced to overwinter a second time, he used the time effectively to make ventures inland. And he attempted to reach the South Magnetic Pole. That didn't quite work out, but he did become the first person to reach the polar plateau, aka the Eastern Arctic ice sheet. He became the first person to actually reach the interior of Antarctica and realize just what a vast expanse of ice there was in the center of the continent. He and his men traveled about a week into the polar plateau before they decided to turn back, mostly because they'd lost their navigational charts and they didn't have a lot of landmarks heading into this vast, empty wilderness of ice. Scott himself almost died while he was falling into a crevasse, which is still a danger to this day. He saw the dry valleys when he was coming back from this attempt to visit the South Magnetic Pole. He also observed the Transantarctic Mountains. He noticed that they went southward from where James Clark Ross had observed them, and this would later excite interest in geologists as well as miners to see what might be in these mountains further south. They also saw emperor penguins. One of their members, Mr. Edward Wilson, made this sketch of emperor penguins with their babies. So they observed the penguin colonies that are seen in movies like March of the Penguins, and the colony that they observed on Ross Island still exists to this day. And so they made a lot of good observations of East Antarctica, and the expedition was hardly a failure, even though they didn't get anywhere near the South Pole. It was really amazing that anybody was managing to survive in Antarctica at all, because they didn't have the climate control and modern technology that makes life at McMurdo Base in modern Antarctica relatively pleasant and relatively not very dangerous. By the way, Black Island, which Scott went by during one of his trips, has the satellite dish that to this very day links McMurdo Base to the internet. McMurdo Base has a very weak internet connection via a satellite dish that is on Black Island, and McMurdo Base is over here. Now, the next expedition is the Dragowski Expedition, which was also called the Gauss Expedition after the ship. And it was the first expedition to Antarctica by Germany, which in fact had only existed as a single unified nation since 1871. And it was seeking to establish itself on equal footing with the UK, France, and other colonial powers. Their expedition headed to the islands of Kerguelen, and that is a large volcanic island that I briefly mentioned in the geography section of this class. It is located in the southern Indian Ocean and is now part of France. It does not have any indigenous population, but it has a small scientific staff that is employed by the French government to this day. Mr. Dragowski left a small crew on Kerguelen and headed south to Antarctica. He visited Heard Island, a small volcanic island now owned by Australia, and he headed to what is now known as Kaiser Wilhelm II land. And Dragowski named that after the Emperor of Germany who had funded the expedition, the very same Kaiser Wilhelm II who would be toppled by the First World War. Dragowski and his men ended up getting stuck in the ice, and they had to overwinter, which is a common thread here. People ending up having to spend a winter there when they don't expect. They managed to eventually free themselves by burning trash to melt the sea. They managed to not melt the ship in the process, or burn the ship in the process, happily. They managed to take the first aerial pictures of Antarctica in the process. This is a picture they took from a camera that was lifted up on an air balloon, and this is their ship stuck in the ice. So they got some of the first aerial pictures of Antarctica, and aerial photography of Antarctica is now really important because it has helped survey a lot more of the continent and the Transantarctic Mountains and made them accessible to people. So these pictures ended up being rather cool, and it also gives you a sense of just the texture of the Antarctic ice, which wasn't really understood before. Now, I would say that of the various Trapped in the Ice episodes that I've come across in the heroic age, theirs wasn't too bad. It seems like they managed pretty well. They even had a small band going. They had plenty of food and alcohol, and they had a little band made of a harmonica, a flute, pot lids for cymbals, and a triangle. So they managed to keep themselves entertained, and they were better prepared with clothing and provisions for the winter than Scott and Borshkovic had been, and so this particular overwintering appears to have been relatively pleasant. Plus, they were able to salvage their ship. Their ship wasn't destroyed, and so they were able to get out pretty easily. It definitely highlighted the fact that it was very possible you could get stuck in Antarctica. But it's funny to me because it's just a little bit of a preview of Ice Talk, and it's a bit of just it tells how humans find ways to entertain themselves even to this day. We have this weird little music festival in Antarctica at McMurdo now, and there was a weird little music festival on board the Gauss ship. So other countries soon began to send their ships as well. Sweden, Scotland, and France began to send ships. The Swedish expedition was in the peninsula, and it was sponsored by geologist Odo Nordenskjöld. It ran into trouble when the ship, which was named the Antarctic, sank, and the Swedish scientists were forced to spend a second winter there. Most of them made it back fine. They ended up being rescued by the Argentine Navy, but it was still kind of a mess. Of the two French expeditions, one was in fact planned as part of a rescue effort for these Swedes. And the Swedish expedition did manage to bring back some new maps of the eastern coast, as well as some rock, bird, and plant samples, so it wasn't a complete disaster. The Scottish expedition is best known for successfully establishing a manned weather station in Antarctica during their stay over, and they were also the first people to explore the eastern Weddell Sea, long after James Weddell himself had failed to find land there. Both of the two French expeditions were commandeered by Jean-Baptiste Charcot, and they were largely mapping exercises. France would later on be one of several countries to claim territory in Antarctica, and many of the subantarctic islands, like Kerguelen, now belong to France as part of the French Southern and Antarctic territories. Now, Shackleton first came into the narrative as part of Scott's first crew. He would commandeer his own first expedition in 1907 aboard the Nimrod. And you'll notice that this brown line represents his more famous expedition from 1914. His first commandeered expedition to Antarctica was in 1907 when he made an almost successful attempt to reach the South Pole. You'll see that this red line, which represents Shackleton's visit, gets almost quite to the South Geographic Pole, but not quite. And that's what he was doing on the Nimrod expedition. Because now people were reasonably sure that there was land there. The French and Swedish expeditions had discovered land in the East Weddell Sea and indicated that there was probably land south of where James Weddell had gone. And Shackleton apparently managed to annoy Scott by choosing Ross Island and McMurdo Sound as a base for his operations because he had apparently promised Sir Robert Falcon Scott not to. He attempted to reach the South Geographic Pole from McMurdo Sound, and it didn't quite work. But they got less than 100 miles away from it, so they got quite close. He was still pretty disappointed by this, unsurprisingly, but a lot of successes came out of this trip. A side party led by one of his mates, by Edgeworth David, successfully reached the South Magnetic Pole, and they confirmed that it was in fact close to where the first Antarctic French expedition, or the Dumont-D'Urville expedition, had expected that South Magnetic Pole to be. Shackleton and his crew also became the first people to climb Mount Erebus, and they were able to look into the volcano, which you can still do to this very day. And they apparently sledded back down Mount Erebus, which is unthinkable today, but I find kind of delightful, honestly. He also tested out a number of innovations in transportation in Antarctica. His men attempted to use cars. They tried to use Manchurian ponies, and sadly the ponies didn't survive the trip. The last of them died falling into a crevasse. So neither ponies nor cars worked very well. Scott would later attempt to adapt some of these same techniques during his subsequent race to the South Pole. It would work somewhat better, but it would still ultimately underscore that if people were to transport around Antarctica, specialized equipment would need to be invented, and that pack animals were generally not going to be practical in Antarctica. even setting aside the welfare concerns, pack animals aren't the most effective way to travel in Antarctica. Now, another member of the trip, Mr. Douglas Mawson, would later lead the Australasian Antarctica Expedition, and he was part of the crew that summited Mount Erebus. And here's a couple of artifacts and pictures. So they actually had, you start to have photos of Antarctica by this time because black and white photography is more commonplace by this point. So you have some pictures of the cars, of the ponies. Shackleton's hut is still preserved. And again, it's really interesting doing archaeology in Antarctica, just how many of the structures from the heroic age are still preserved by the fact that it's so cold and dry. One expedition I want to touch on briefly is one that I didn't know existed until recently, but there was, in fact, a Japanese expedition to Antarctica during the heroic age, and it was the first expedition to Antarctica by a non-European country. And it was the only heroic age Antarctic expedition that was mainly commandeered by people of non-European descent. And it was privately funded. It was commandeered by an adventurer and Army Reserve lieutenant named Nobu Shirase, who's pictured here. And this happened around the same time as the race to the South Pole, which we will learn about during the second half of this lecture. And Mr. Shirase had, in fact, dreamed of reaching the North Pole, but he had given up after that because Matthew Hansen and Robert Peary had reached it first. Just as the South Pole would later be precluded by visitors. So Nobu Shirase and his men failed to land during their first season, and they had to overwinter in Australia, during which time Scott and Amundsen began their attempts to reach the South Pole. So Shirase and his men attempted to reach Antarctica during a second season, and they managed to land in the Edward VII Peninsula, which is on the east end of the Ross Sea. They made it back to Japan without any injury or any loss of life. But the expedition was largely forgotten because it was overshadowed by the two successful trips to the South Pole. And since Shirase had largely self-funded his expedition, he ended up dealing with all the debt. And the Imperial Japanese government ended up not being particularly interested in exploration. And so Japan did not make another attempt to visit Antarctica until it would eventually build a base in the 20th century. So that has been a bit of a mouthful. But we will have more exciting tales from the heroic age of Antarctic exploration after a short break. Or, well, it'll be in the second half of the video. So, look forward to that.